Welcome to Leave No Doubt. I've been joined by a very talented and experienced scout, Des Taylor. Des, how you doing, mate?
I'm fine, thank you.
I appreciate you being here with me, mate. I think this is it's going to be a real nice perspective for people to get a real insight into scouting and what that looks like and the process and how that has an impact ultimately on players.
Yep.
So to get us started, mate, I thought it might be a nice idea if you gave yourself a little bit of an introduction for the listeners, and include an insight into your scouting journey and how you are where you are today.
Okay, that could take a while, but I'll try and microwave it. Played at non-league level, the one below conference. Always had an interest in football, always had an interest in seeing football not as a partisan supporter. I was a Birmingham City supporter for my troubles. So went home and away Birmingham City, everywhere during my 20s, but always saw football differently to the average football supporter. Then started doing a little bit of scouting. A guy called Bill Caldwell and Ian Atkins, who's still active in the scouting market, helped them a little bit when Birmingham City were on their arse, basically, and was doing a little bit of local scouting, a little bit of youth scouting, but never took it seriously. I had a full-time job. Then in 2004, I moved away from Birmingham and went to live in a place called Stamford in Lincolnshire. And a friend of mine was the chief scout at Bristol Rovers. Paul Trollope was the manager. He asked me if I would do some opposition reports along that sort of eastern A1 corridor. So I started doing opposition reports at places like Boston, Lincoln, Grimsby, Colchester, Hartlepool, and found out I was pretty good at it. I've only got Paul Trollope's word for that. So, and from that, took me up to two. And I was also working for an agency that used to be called Scouting Network. So that evolved in the long term into Y-Scout. So I was doing reports for Middlesbrough, Peterborough. So Darren Ferguson I got introduced to off the back of that, a guy called Dave Ledbetter at Middlesbrough. So I was doing their opposition scouting reports because they hadn't got opposition scouts. So the agency charged them a set fee and then paid me a mileage on it. So I was actually starting to get some income now from being involved in football. And then a fateful day in March 2009, I met Eddie Howe. I introduced myself to him. It didn't go very well, to be honest, Joe. Like, I was at Barnet and I was doing a report that day on Bournemouth for Brentford through the agency. So I introduced myself to Eddie in the pre-match warm-ups, which had I known then what I know now, I would never have done, but I did. And Eddie more or less suggested I leave him alone in a nice way. But I'd seen Eddie at the previous Barnet game and realised that he was doing his own opposition scouting report and hadn't got a scout, and saw that as an opportunity to get an association with the club by introducing myself to Eddie at the next game. But he showed no interest and said, look, the club's absolutely skint. We can't afford to pay scouts. We're close to liquidation. We're going to get relegated to the conference. There's nothing you can do to help. So I produced my report. It was for Andy Scott at Brentford. Sent the report in on the Sunday morning on Bournemouth. They were due to play Brentford the week after. After the game, Brentford beat Bournemouth 1-0. I then sent my report to Neil Vacher, who was the club secretary at AFC Bournemouth. Shows how long ago it was. I sent it by fax. And 2 days later, I took a phone call and didn't recognise the number. And he said, "Hi, this is Eddie Howe." And I said, "Really? Yeah, what can I do for you?" And he asked me about the report and how I'd compiled it and what information and knowledge I had to give such a concise report on his team. And I told him that it was purely visual from that game. No stats, nothing like that, no video, no. The Y-Scout wasn't Y-Scout then, so you couldn't get access to footage from the game. And he said, "Look, come down and see us." And I went down and seen him, and the rest is history. I ended up doing all the opposition reports for the remainder of that season at my own expense, and for the whole of the next season, which we got promoted from League Division 2 to Division 1. I think I did something like 64 opposition reports, maybe 70. But obviously I was also looking at players, and we were in transfer embargoed at the time. So whilst I was looking at things from an opposition perspective to help Eddie in terms of his tactical setup for the next game, and because there was no real visual aids for Eddie at that time because the club had no money, so he was relying on people like John Coleman at Accrington to send him a DVD. But you had to wait for the postman to turn up to do it. So, and built a relationship with Eddie, one trust and listen. I wasn't exactly what he wanted, but I came for nothing, so he put up with it. And at the end of that, Eddie then went on to Burnley. I stayed at Bournemouth for a few months, then followed him up to Burnley, then followed him back to Bournemouth via other avenues, and have been with him ever since. And obviously, when he finished at Bournemouth, I carried on at Bournemouth, and I'm still at Bournemouth to this day. And I've never done an opposition report since 2011 when we went to Burnley, because managers don't need opposition reports anymore. They have everything that they need at their fingertips. And that's the evolution of football, visual football tools and analytical data, etc., etc. Analysts are far more relevant now than they've ever been in terms of preparation pre and post match. So I threw myself into recruitment, and that's where I've been ever since.
How do scouts, Des, because people won't really know, it's not, scouting is something that everybody would probably have a perception of but not really know a lot of detail into. Are you, across your career as a scout, are you told what to look for, or do you base, what you see on the match day and when you spot players off your own opinion?
Working for Eddie had its pitfalls, but was also quite simple in the fact that it was easy to rule players out for Eddie on a technical basis, on an athleticism basis. So the key things to look for Eddie, to recruit for Eddie, is technical ability, attitude, application, athleticism, speed. Okay, not all the players we've recruited had all of those attributes, but you have to shop in the market that you're in. And what he looks for now at Newcastle would not be what he was looking for necessarily when we signed Mark Pugh all those years ago in 2011. You have to work within the confines of the budget and know what components are needed for that manager to be successful in the team. I tend to work autonomously in terms of I'm very organic in the way I scout, but a lot of people don't do it the way I do it. I'm very fortunate that I have that flexibility to work my way. But as long as you produce results, then people don't question the provenance of what you do. But you have to be aware of your budget. I can't be saying we should sign this kid Messi. It's you've got to know what you're actually got to spend. It's
interesting, Des, you're talking right now, obviously, that you're employed by a football club and you're employed to find players for that team.
Yes.
But before then, obviously, you'd have been a scout off your own back and you'd have been watching players and building opinions on them whenever you saw them. So we're going to try and split it in, and we'll speak about in a little bit more detail soon about working maybe for one club specifically.
Yep.
But scouting in general, I think a lot of people, if parents are listening to this, which they, I know some do, and if players are listening to this that may or may not be in academies or may not be at the level that they think they might be, what is the process of players being scouted? What happens? What does it look like?
Okay, well, from a club perspective, there are two different ways. There's the academy scouting and there's the first team scouting. I've only ever done first team scouting. Academy scouting is different, entirely different, in it's more regionalised. So academy scouts will turn up at schools games, local divisional games, representation games for the area. Whatever game they think that they're going to find a good young player that will fit into their academy. And that starts as young as 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. From my perspective, I've never scouted that way. I don't think I'd be very good at it because I haven't got the patience, quite honestly. But what I would say to younger players, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, is that a lot of the scouts that scout at that age are anonymous. You would not know that they're a scout. So there will be scouts at every school game, at every representational game, but you won't even know they're there. And a lot of those scouts work for agents, not necessarily for clubs. So agents are omnipresent. They're ubiquitous. They're everywhere. It's not necessarily the agent that's there. It's the person that will give the names to the agent, who will then approach the parents, etc., etc. From a club perspective, there are scouts from the academies, no matter who it is. In the South Coast, it will be obviously Southampton, Portsmouth, Bournemouth. And you won't know they're there, but they're there. From my perspective, it was entirely different. I started in Northern Conference North. So when I was living in the West Midlands, I'd go to places like Stourbridge, Worcester, Kidderminster. That's how I started. And then you challenge yourself to be capable of identifying young players with the prospects of developing. And then you ally that to who you're recruiting for and what qualities the player has that you look for in a player for whoever you're recruiting for, and then work from there.
So do you think it's fair to say, Des, that, you know, young players now, and, you know, any player actually of any age really, you know, if people have a certain perception of themselves, or, you know, I should have got this move, or I should have got this move, or I should have been scouted when I was younger, and they haven't, would you think it's fair to say that if you are good enough, there's enough people around now watching football that you will get spotted?
100%. That will happen. And probably be a little bit controversial here is that sometimes the parents promote, because it's a natural instinct as a parent to want your child to be the best or be better than his peers. Parents become too active in trying to chase the dream. If the player's good enough, whatever age he is, the dream will come to him. And then it's about his aptitude, his application, his dedication. So you don't have to go out looking for it as a parent and as a young player. It'll find you if you're good enough.
So go on then, Des. If, you know, I'm a talented player, or you know, or I'm a parent of a talented player, what should I do?
Try to be offer guidance to that whatever age, whether they're going through adolescence or whatever. Just on a side or a derivative of that, there are players that I could mention now that were cast off because they were too small or too weak at the ages of 10, 11, 12, 13, who now play in the Premier League, because they matured later. They went through adolescence later. There are other players that are very precocious as a 11, 12, 13-year-old, and adolescence comes early to them. They're bigger and stronger than the other boys. So they get picked up quicker because it's natural, it's physical. But then you see, in the majority of cases, when they get to 16, 17, 18, and their development physically, their maturity slows down a little bit, and the boys that were behind them physically then catch up, and then it's about talent and technique and ability. So players that at the age of 11, 12, 13, 14 may have stood out physically because they were bigger and stronger and faster than their peers, it may well be that later on, those players that were immature physically and possibly mentally catch up and are actually better footballers in the long term. So there are many, many different facets to how it works and how it potentially can work, and a lot of it is driven by the child himself, and they need good guidance from their parents. I go and watch my grandson play now, and he's a good player. But I'm not pushing him. I know he can. He's capable of going into an academy. He's 11 now, but I want to wait until the time is right till I take him somewhere. But nepotism plays a huge part. That every parent thinks their kid's the best, and sometimes they push too hard. And my advice to parents would be patient, and try to be composed when you're watching your son. And it'll come to you. You don't have to go and find it. If your boy's good enough, it will come.
Yeah, that's interesting because, you know, I've had conversations with people recently, and I've spoken about it a couple of times actually on this podcast about a conversation I had with a friend when I went, you know, back to Portsmouth recently, and they said, "Oh, my friend's 9-year-old's in an academy at the moment. I think my son's just as good as him, and he's not involved. Like, if he doesn't get an academy by now, he'll you know, he's not going to make it." And even in Paul Merson recently has come out and been quoted as saying, if your child, you know, not son and daughter, if your child isn't in an academy by the age of 14, then they should, you know, wave goodbye to the to the dream of making it as a professional footballer, which a lot of people have sort of argued against. But there is an age. There's obviously where a dream needs to be waved goodbye to. What age, in your opinion, is that?
I'll cite Jamie Vardy as an example. So, okay, he had a few problems, not related to football, but when he was at Sheffield Steel, he was 21, 22, and he was never going to play in the Premier League. He was playing in the Northern Premier League, and yet he got scouted by Halifax, went to Halifax, got scouted by every club you can think of at sort of League One and upwards, but not so much the Premier League. Fleetwood took a risk, spent 350,000 on him. We looked at him. We were at Burnley at the time. We looked at him, and I weren't having him. I just thought he was quick. That was it. Obviously, you don't get everyone right, and I certainly got Jamie Vardy wrong. I took the assistant manager with me to watch him, and even he wasn't having him. So, and then the next thing you know, he goes to Fleetwood. He's got a good agent, John Morris, who pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed, and next thing you know, he rocks up at Leicester for £1 million, and the rest is history. So at 21, he was playing Northern Premier League. So it's I won't say it's never say never. It's never too late. But if you look at Jamie Vardy and use that as an example, at 21 years old, we're still playing Northern Premier League, then there's hope for everybody. My take on it is that as 14, 15-year-olds, there is clearly something in a player that's going to go on to play at elite level that you can see. But another example, David Brooks, he was weak and skinny and small, was released by Manchester City's academy at the age of 16, I think, and had to start all over again. Another example, Josh Brownhill, was released by Manchester United's academy. I first saw Josh playing for Warrington in a training session, just because I lived up there when I was working for Burnley, and he ended up going on trial to Preston because Manchester United released him when he was 15 because he was weak and small and frail, and now he's a proven Premier League player. So they weren't picked up till they were 16, 17, 18. In David's case, Sheffield United gave him a chance when he was 18. So you never say never, but it's different for different individuals as to their maturity and when they actually come out of adolescence and into manhood or womanhood, as the case may be. But yeah, the door is always open because people are always watching.
It's such a huge quote, isn't it? People are always watching. And I remember maybe a couple of years ago now, I saw you, I can't remember the name of the player, but at Kings Lynn away, we had a game, Eastie versus Kings Lynn.
Sonny Kerry,
yeah. And I remember seeing you at the game. So, what are you doing here, Des? Surely you're not trying to take me anywhere. But obviously you weren't. And, you were spotted a young player that was playing for Kings Lynn that you had an interest in, obviously for Bournemouth at the time. But this national, I'm interested to get your thoughts because the standard of football in this country is obviously on the rise. There's so many players, and I've spoken about this before, there's so many players under 18s, under 23s at elite football clubs that don't all make it. And where do they go? More often than not, it's the National League North and South, and those sort of levels. Young players now, more than ever, really are being picked up from those levels, from those leagues, and are now getting league moves. How apparent is that for a scout now that that's a really popular place to play football?
I can give you a concise answer to that. It's a numbers game. So academies are recruiting players that they probably 70 or 80%, particularly the mid-range academies. I'd put Bournemouth potentially in that category, but depending on budgets. But it's a numbers game for the big clubs, is that they will recruit X, Y, Z, 10, 15, 20. They'll have an intake every year. And of course, they're going to go for elite, what they perceive to be elite talent, but it's a numbers game. And out of every 20 they take in, maybe one or two are going to make it. Well, that means 18 or 19 are not going to be taken forward with scholarships or whatever they have in their academy. So they're going to drop out of the system. Well, it depends on the boy and the character of the boy or girl as to how they deal with that. And that's where they need parental support. If they've got an agent, possibly a good agent, he's going to support them and will find them an opportunity then. Like, for instance, my son is involved with Banbury United at the moment. They are picking up players that have fell out of the system at the age of 16, 17, 18 and were deemed not good enough. So they get an opportunity to go and play at Southern Premier League, Northern Premier League, or even below that in the pyramid rungs 7 and 8. And that's what happened with Sonny Carey, the player you're referring to. He'd been at Norwich's academy, was allowed to leave Norwich's academy. I'd never heard of him. And then I get a heads up from one of my regional scouts. I've got people who all over the country are watching games. Nobody knows that they're watching. They don't put tickets on for these games or anything like that. But this guy rang me up and he said, look, there's a lad here, you need to have a look at him. So I took it upon myself. I didn't tell anybody at Bournemouth. I just got in the car and drove to Kings Lynn to watch a game, loved him, and tried really, really hard to sign him. He ended up going to Blackpool. He was on the bench at the weekend. He's had some injury problems, but I'm sure he's going to be an established championship player. So at the age of 21, he'd fallen out the system at the age of 16, 17, but persevered, and now he's getting rewarded. So he's gone from 400 quid a week at Kings Lynn, part-time. I think he's on about $3,000 a week at Blackpool now. The next step for him, if he's a success at Blackpool, will be to go again and then get the wage increment that is consummate to that. So yeah, you never know.
See, there's so many players out there, Des, that you've spotted at different stages of their development. And I'm interested to know, and I'm sure other people are, is that when you say, let's take this, the Kings Lynn player, for example, when you go and watch him, you know that he's been released by Norwich, but, you're watching him on a match day. So you're seeing his technical ability, his physical ability. You don't know anything about his mentality or what he's like as a person. How well that he's dealt with all this hardship that he's been through and how he's able to overcome that. So as a scout, how is it that you're able to learn about players, not just obviously from your eye and technical and physical ability, but how do you learn about players in terms of what they're capable of mentally, and emotionally?
Okay, one of the first things I'd advise a scout to do is to watch the warm-ups, because you can see how a player applies himself in the warm-ups. A good scout will get there 45 minutes, an hour before kick-off, which I do. If it's a team that I know the players, then not so important. But that night when I went to Kings Lynn, I was in the boardroom with the chairman, because obviously he wants to sell the player, so he's making me feel very welcome. And I said, you'll have to excuse me, I've got to pop outside. I went out and watched the warm-ups. And I could see that technically straight away you could see he got something better than the rest of the players that he was warming up with. And then I look at application, attitude. One of the most important things that I've taught or said to the people that I work with and have worked with me is, how do they respond to transition, particularly for attacking players? When there's a transition, do they show an aptitude to chase back and work back and help the team? Or do they just, for want of a better expression, toss it off? You can learn an awful lot about a player from what he doesn't do and what he does when the ball's not around. So that for me is very, very important. It's not, as a scout, I don't follow the ball, I follow the player. It's not easy when you're watching 22 players like in a European under-19s qualifier. But if you're specifically looking at 2 or 3 players, you don't necessarily have to follow the ball as a scout. You look what the reaction of the player is to adversity, transitions, recovery runs, all that sort of stuff. And that gives you an indication as to whether they're a committed individual, whether they're tenacious, whether they apply themselves. And it also gives you an indication as to their mental courage as well. So it's something that I always pride myself on is being able to watch warm-ups and watch players' reactions to adversity.
That's interesting, Des. I never thought that, a warm-up would be seen as such an important part of, a scout's role.
I don't think it's important to every scout, but it is to me, because if a player in the warm-up doesn't seem engaged with the warm-up, what does that tell you? That tells you it's like the kid at school who thinks the lesson's too easy for him, so doesn't bother trying to learn.
See, you've mentioned a couple of times, Des, already, agents and, how important agents now are into the game. To give people, a little bit of perspective, I've actually, I've done an agency course online with a sort of like an online school, SBI Barcelona, very good. And you were one of the guest speakers, in that course. I remember listening to you. Spoke very well about the relationship between agents and scouts and players. So what is you know, for a better question, what is the ultimate relationship between scouts and agents, and how important are agents now into the process of you getting a player for a club?
Depending on the agent, it's vital. Like every profession in life, there are good agents and there are bad agents. I have to be cautious here, not to be too controversial, but the bigger agents domestically control probably 70% of the market now in the UK. So there are 5 or 6, they know who they are, that control 70% of the UK domestic market. And going back to the start of this conversation, when I say you don't know who's watching, and I'll say Stella, Base, USG, they will have people everywhere. They're not on the payroll necessarily. They don't introduce themselves to people necessarily. They are watching all over the country young players, and they will recommend further up the food chain to their paymasters. You need to look at this player. You need to get in touch with the parents, etc. Having a good agent for a precocious young player these days is absolutely vital. And from a player's perspective, parents seem to think that they can control the situation, but they can't, because it will be taken out of their hands at some point. So parents have got to be receptive to the agent situation, because it will give their child a better opportunity to have if they've got a good agent who cares about their progress and their welfare and their education. And I would advise any parent out there who is approached by agents not to just jump into bed with the first one that comes along, but to do their homework, to have formal meetings with the agents to make sure that the one that they choose is the one that gives their child the best chance of progressing.
It's interesting, you know, you've said a good agent quite a lot of times there, Des, and you know, some players won't have had agents before, especially young players. Some parents will think they've got a good idea of football, but won't. As we know, there's a lot of parents that have an opinion that may not be relevant in actually the professional game. So, in your, you know, I know this is obviously your opinion, but this is the reason why you're here, because you're giving us an incredible insight. But what does separate good from bad agents?
I don't think there's one clear defining factor, but it's natural that most agents and most agencies will be financially motivated. But in the embryonic stage of developing a relationship with the player and the parents, finance is not something that needs to be discussed. And I think my understanding of the preconception from parents is that the agents are only in it for one thing. Well, possibly, yeah. But in those initial phases of a 14, 15, 16-year-old kid, that is not their motivation. Their motivation is that further down the line, if they give good advice to this player, they will reap the financial benefits as and when he develops. So in the initial phases, the agent is there as somebody to advise, somebody to that they can speak to and get advice from, somebody who will point them in direction of the right club if clubs do come knocking on the door, and not just take the first opportunity that comes up. It may well be that for a player down on the South Coast, if Southampton knock on the door, it doesn't mean to say, because they're at Academy 1 status, it might be better for him to go to Portsmouth where there's a clearer pathway. The agent will give advice. And of course, in the long term, if the agent gives good advice, he will reap the benefits financially further down the line. So an agent is vitally important, and a good agent who gives good advice and is not motivated by earning a quick buck, that's important.
You've mentioned it already, mate. I really wasn't aware that, you know, I say in youth football, but in all football now, really at any level, that a scout's job can sometimes now be done by an agent almost, that you've alluded to, that sometimes the agents are actually picking the kids up instead of the scouts, and the agents are taking them to the scouts. Yep. How apparent is that now in the game? Very
apparent, yeah. So I think scouts, I can only speak for myself, but I speak to a lot of scouts, and the majority of them are driven not by finance and financial incentives. They're driven by wanting success for the club and by default for themselves in terms of their recommendations as players. So there's a different motivation. There's a different reason for wanting to be a scout or scouting for an agency. Scouting for a club is entirely different to scouting for an agency. Now, I'll work off recommendations from agents, particularly abroad. Obviously, as you know, I do a lot of work abroad, not as probably more abroad than I do domestically. But I possibly have to work on more tip-offs from agents from the overseas market than I do from the domestic market, because we don't have a budget at Bournemouth to organically scout 14, 15, 16-year-olds all over the country. Geographically, that's nigh on impossible. So I have to rely on tip-offs from agents about young players. But generally, if they're any good, they're going to end up at one of the big academies. Where in the north, it's Man City, it's Man United, it's Liverpool, it's Newcastle are going to have a right go with developing their academy. And in the south, obviously, you've got the big London clubs: Arsenal, Tottenham, Chelsea. So the majority of very good young players gravitate to those clubs. And then the other clubs, if it's in the northwest, say a Blackburn or a Bolton or a Preston, they pick up the crumbs from the rich man's table. If it's down south, Millwall, Charlton, etc., etc. So to answer your question, I organically, it's difficult to scout, to be omnipresent, to be everywhere you need to be. So then you will work off tip-offs from agents. When I say tip-offs, they will recommend that you come and watch their player. But I don't get involved in the academy side of scouting. So if somebody knows better, I'm sure they could let you know. But that's the way I see it.
My last little bit on agents, Des, because I want to try and get into a discussion about statistics and analytics, like you've previously mentioned. But how often do you see that agents might stop deals being done, for whatever reason? And what reason would that be for them breaking the deal down?
Are we talking about players that have already got a public profile, or players before they emerge as a talent?
Maybe that are already playing.
Okay, well, there's one example, I won't name it, but that was at a Premier League club until the last transfer window and has now moved to another Premier League club. And the agent felt that he wasn't getting a fair crack of the whip at the club that he was at, refused multiple contract offers that were put in front of him from the club that he was at, because they saw a pathway, but they didn't see a progression of him actually playing first team football. Difficult for me to sit on the fence with this one, because in my opinion, the player was clearly good enough to be playing, but politically, because he wasn't signing the contract, he wasn't playing. And he's moved to another club, a bigger club now in the Premier League, and he'll be a household name within 2 or 3 years. The player knows who I'm talking about, and the agent knows who, and the two clubs will know, but I'm not going to say who it is. But so the agent basically controlled the situation, and the club tried to take back control of that situation and failed. Now they got well paid, well remunerated for the player services and the amount of work that had been put in at their academy over the years that he'd been at their academy. They got a big fee for the player, but they may live to regret selling that player for what they had to sell him for, and that was where an agent sort of controlled that situation. And the club realised it was being taken out of their hands and had to cash in while he'd still got some time left on his contract.
Hopefully, I mean, people listen to this. Quite often, the people that reach out to me are players. I know there's a lot of people with just an interest in football that might want an insight into how scouting and agency works, and a lot of parents. So hopefully, your opinion on agents there, mate, has given people a real good insight into how they can make their own decisions for themselves and feel comfortable. I know it's difficult, and there's not sort of like a right or wrong answer, but you've given good advice there on what a good agent looks like.
The agent has to have the best interests of the player and as a younger age, the family at heart. It has to be morally, the agent needs to do the right thing for the player, and in the long term, it does become about money further down the line. But in the initial phases, as a player goes through his career development, he needs to be getting good advice from a good agent.
Okay, mate. So to move on a little bit, because one of the biggest probably arguments, or not necessarily an argument, but discussions in football over the last few years have been statistics and analytics on players that do well. That stats seem to be so popular now, mate, that, you know, even if players aren't performing very well, like how many goals have they scored, how many assists have they got, you know, it's really changed the game. And I'm sure it has done in your industry as well. So, you know, where we've got to now in the game, Des, are scouts still able to spot a player on their abilities, or is it now all about numbers?
Over the last 5 years, that has definitely changed. My ability to embrace the statistical and analytical data, I'm on the periphery of that. I will still, it's difficult because people describe it as being old school when you're out scouting. And if you look around these days compared to 15 or 20 years ago, there are less and less scouts watching games live at the top level. At the C, we're not talking about academy or because stats aren't available, data isn't available. I'm not sure it's particularly the way to go. I embrace it, and I will internally I will use the statistics and the data as a compass to point me in the right direction at times. But it's a chicken and egg situation. What come first? The data and the analytics, or watching a player live? Whichever way you get to the end result, it doesn't matter to me as long as you get there. But there are pros and cons to the statistics and the data, and the higher up you go, the more you go towards the elite level, the more important it becomes. There's no doubt about that. So at a lower level, and there's one club at the moment that I could tell you about in League One that have got one of the smallest budgets in League One, and they are at the moment considering going down a data and analytical route. And I spoke to their chief exec, and I advised him not necessarily to do that, because the data and the statistics that are generated at the lower levels are, in my opinion, and I'll stand to be corrected by an expert on this, not as reliable, and B, it doesn't matter so much about the statistics for a player in League Two or data in a player in League Two or the Conference as it does for a player in the Premier League and top-end Championship. So whilst I do embrace it, and whilst I do understand that we are becoming more and more literate in data analysis and the numbers and the algorithms, and, you know, certain clubs like Liverpool have got their own algorithm that they work to that tells them about the player, about the strengths, about the weaknesses, even to the point where it says what you should be paying the player and the term of contract you should be giving the player. So I get it and I understand it. There will always be a place for live scouting, always. But the organic side of scouting, of just turning up at a game and hoping you find something, those opportunities are becoming less and less, because the analytical and data models will probably reveal a player at elite level much quicker than actually going and scouting the player. So an example I'll use, there was a player in Sweden 5-6 years ago who was top assists, top in crosses, top in duels 1v1, was off the scale with the data. And I just happened to organically turn up to watch that player, and then realised that a club in England was also had a scout at the game. This was in Sweden, in the middle of nowhere. And this scout said to me, the data says he's absolutely unbelievable. I said, oh, really? I said, well, does the data know who he's playing against? Oh, what do you mean by that? I said, well, does the data know that the right back for Degerfors is terrible? So he's going to be top on duels. He's going to be top on 1v1 winning duels. He's going to be top on crosses, because they don't stop. They show no intention to stop the cross. So he'll probably put 14 crosses into the box today. Can he go and replicate that in the Premier League or the Championship? Absolutely not, because the data's flawed, because you're reading data that doesn't apply to where you want it to transmit to. So the data in Sweden, he may be off the scale in Sweden, but when he comes to the Championship and he comes up against a 6'2" right back, is he going to be able to put 14 crosses in the box? I don't think he is. And is he going to win every duel he takes on? I don't think he is. So that's where live scouting was more important, in my opinion. And that player did sign for an English club in the Championship, had a modicum of success, but lasted a year. and now he's playing in second league in France. So the data was, in my opinion, the facts were there, but the data was flawed because the data doesn't take into account who you're playing against and the level that you're playing at. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So how often has it happened that you've, been tipped off by a player because of the data and been to watch them and then been, let's say, unimpressed by their performance?
Okay, so I've been accused of being a Luddite in the past and not embracing the data. So I go back to 2017, a player that everybody will know, Naby Keita. He was off the scale. I mean, off the scale in data. And so I went to watch because the compass had pointed it. Go and watch. So I went to Red Bull Salzburg against Sturm Graz. And within 20 minutes, I knew the data was right. This player was unbelievable. He was so much better than everybody else that was on the pitch. So the data actually flagged up this player as being completely and utterly way better than anybody else in that league. An Austrian league is not great, to be honest. There are lots of good young players that come through, but it's not great. And I literally, after the game, picked the phone up and said, got to sign this player. He's unbelievable. Little did I know Liverpool would already. So, yeah, in that case, the data was right because he was so much better. And off the back of that, there was a player that came through to replace Naby Keita, who I thought was even better, but his data was not quite as good, but he's having a boy called Amadou Haidara. So the data pointed the compass there, and I embraced that. And everybody at the club thought I was going to turn around and go, he's terrible. It's a terrible league, terrible game. Anybody could play at that level. Well, no, I didn't. I was actually enthused and encouraged by it. And I thought this data, the data is brilliant. So you've still got to know what you're looking for. No matter how much data and analytics are done, you still got to know what you're looking for.
So how often have you gone to watch players that the data hasn't matched up with your eye?
Not very often because I sort of still tend to be organic. I still tend to, if I'm given data, a pointer by the recruitment group and they say the data on this player is saying you need to go and watch this player, I'll do it. But my perspective is 80 to 90% of the time I'll watch the games, then look at the data because I don't want the data to skew my eye. So I would much rather do it that way around. But at elite level, I'm probably very much in the minority.
I'm interested to know, Des, when I was much younger,
long time ago, Joe.
Long time, I'm old now, but I left Bournemouth, signed for Eastleigh, and I remember playing at Eastleigh thinking, I'm desperate to progress with my career. I was desperate to use that as an opportunity to get higher up. And there was a guy at the time, recently retired, actually, a good friend of mine called Jay Reason, who was playing.
Jay Reason played for Cambridge United.
Yeah, Cambridge. He went Ipswich to Cambridge.
Stocky centre forward.
That's him. Yeah, good player. And when I signed for Eastleigh, he had loads of interest from league clubs, and I was being told by a lot of people, this Jay Reason, he's getting a lot of interest. A lot of people are coming to watch him. And I remember thinking, if they're coming to watch him, if I play well, I might get noticed as well. How often does it happen that
all the time?
Yeah, say if I've got like a super talented player in my team that people are coming to watch, they actually spot somebody else.
All the time. And it goes back to what we said at the beginning. You never know who's watching and you never know why they're there to watch or who they're there to watch. And it's happened to me on multiple occasions where I just go to games where I look at the composition of squads and teams. I look at which manager is managing them. Are they a coach that's going to give young players an opportunity? Are they a coach that's going to develop young players? So I'll pick and choose my games quite often by looking at the composition of the squads, looking at the average age of the team. It's no good me going and watching 27-year-old journeymen. I need to be watching 18, 19-year-old kids who have recently made their debut and seeing if there is a progression pathway for them. And I'll turn up at a game and get the team sheet. I'll put the ages on the date of birth on. I think, this kid on the bench, he's an 01. He might be worth staying for if he gets on. And all of a sudden you see this player and you think, oh my God, how did I not know about this player? So you may turn up with an objective reason, but that's not to say that you're not open to what else is out there. And it opens your eyes sometimes that you turn up thinking you're watching 2 or 3 players, and then this player comes from nowhere and you think, wow. And then I'll go back and watch him again and again and again if necessary. So I'm always open to progressive young players that haven't really been given an opportunity to make their impression on me. And it's happened many, many times where I've turned up at a game with an open mind, and a player that I didn't think was going to impress me or didn't know anything about does. So
someone's always watching such a powerful message, isn't it? Yeah, no, like my parents always used to say it to me, but you know, as you do when you're a kid, you just think, oh, whatever, like you've got no idea. But it, you know, it genuinely is one of the most true statements in football, right? Yeah.
Well, there's again, I'll cite an example. There's a lad playing for Sparta Prague called Matej Rineš. He's got every attribute to be a top player. He's a number 10, left-footed, can play wide, left, wide, right, number 10. He's just turned 19, checking under 19 international. I gave him a lift home. I shouldn't be telling you this, but I gave him a lift home from a representative game in Czech Republic, 3-hour drive. And he said, what did you think? And I said, yeah, you were great with the ball. With the ball, yeah? I said, yeah, but your attitude, your application, your body language was horrific. You can have all the attributes you want, technically, aesthetically, athletically, but you didn't. I'm there watching lots of players tonight. If I'm picking up on you, you are not getting any more than a monitor from me, because whilst you have those attributes, your attitude was terrible and your reaction to disappointment was bad. You never know who's watching. And I don't think he's going to be a top player that he should be, because I don't think he's ever going to have that mentality to work hard. He thinks everything's going to come to him naturally. And we had an argument in the car, and he said, like, you know, who the hell do you think you are? And I said, well, for every one of me, there's another 100 out there that'll probably say the same thing. So you truly never know who's watching, and you have to apply yourself in every aspect of what you do, whether it's the warm-up, whether it's your recovery runs, your reactions to transitions, your reaction to something not going the way you wanted it to in the game. You miss an open goal, how do you respond? Do you down tool, shrug your shoulders, drop your head? Or do you think, no, I'm going to get the next chance and score? That sometimes defines the elite players from the average ones.
Can you give me a little bit of an insight then, Des, into what happens once you've spotted a talented player that you think is going to be good enough to, you know, use Bournemouth for an example, and let's use the example of the young Kings Lynn player that you went to have a look at. What is the process off the back of you watching him?
Can we use another example, because I did something I shouldn't have done there.
Right, yeah, right. Well, we'll make an example.
I rang the dad, so
right.
I didn't know who the agent was, so I just got the dad's number and rang the dad, introduced myself. I shouldn't do that, but fortunately for me, I'd been with the chairman at Kings Lynn. He says, yeah, feel free to ring him up, because he was desperate to turn him into Reddies.
Well, if we used like a generic example,
Ryan Fraser.
Okay, so you've spotted Ryan Fraser playing.
Yeah.
What is then the process? Because people are going to be interested, if it ever happens to them, to be aware of. What's the process of you spotting Ryan Fraser to him ending up as a Bournemouth player?
So went the first time he came off the bench for the last 15 minutes. Needed to find out if he was starting. It's a long way to Aberdeen, and there's no point me driving all the way there if he's not playing. So went up the next time he was on the bench again. So I thought, right, I'm going to have to find out who the agent is at some point or another, because he's obviously got something. Ryan was 18 at the time, so found out who the agent was, rang the agent. The agent happened to be John McLeish at the time, Alex McLeish's son. Said, look, you know, I've been watching the boy. Can you give me the heads up when he's going to start? Because I need to come and see him play from the start, not 10 minutes cameo off the bench. 2 weeks later, he rang me on the Friday. He's starting. I drove straight up to Aberdeen, living in Manchester at the time, so it wasn't so difficult. It was only like 350 miles. But watched him, loved him. John wanted to come to the game with me. I said, I do not want you within 100 metres of me, because straight away they know who the Bournemouth scout is, and if they see the agent with the scout, they put, when I say they, the club, Derek McInnes was the manager at the time, I think it might have been before Derek, but they're going to put 2 and 2 together and come up with 4. So a lot of scouts tend to have relationships with specific agents. I don't do that. I just do my thing. Most of the time, an agent doesn't even know I'm watching their player until I make the phone call and tell him. So I followed it up with John McLeish, registered the interest, informed my manager as to that discussion and whether or not the agent was receptive. It's up to the agent if he tells the player. That's not my business. And then proceeded from there, watched Ryan another couple of 3 times, spoke to the agent about the numbers that it would need to take to get him out of Aberdeen, what the contract situation is, what his salary is, then engaged in an initial contract negotiation before we approach Aberdeen. And Aberdeen got a fair price for their player. Ryan Fraser ended up coming to Bournemouth. The agent got paid. Everybody was happy, particularly Eddie Howe.
But you were obviously working on behalf of the football club. Then you were
Absolutely,
working on behalf of Bournemouth. So, are there scouts? The scouts that aren't working on, or are most scouts working on behalf of football clubs now?
Again, I'm in a very unique situation, or was, that I had the autonomy to go and do that type of thing. Not all scouts have that. Are given that responsibility. I tended to take it upon myself, to be honest, because we were such a small scout. I was the only scout Bournemouth had for 3 or 4 years. So if I wasn't going to do it, nobody else was. Whereas at a big club, a Manchester United, a Liverpool, and Everton, whatever, the scout is just there to identify the ability of the player. He hands that on to somebody further up the food chain than him to make the contact. So the phone call will normally come from a chief scout, head of recruitment, technical director, to the agent, and then proceed from there. So once the scout has pushed it up the food chain and said, you really, really need to look at this player, it gets taken to a level above the scout, effectively. But I've been very, very fortunate that as my football club have always trusted me and encouraged me to engage and do a little bit more than the average scout, and I'm very, very privileged to be in that position. But Bournemouth have always allowed me that freedom.
So how were you even aware of who Ryan Fraser was in the first place? How's that?
Stevie Lovell. Stevie Lovell was playing up at Dundee United, Ed's stepbrother, and he says there's a little wee fella playing at Aberdeen. He hasn't played any first team games, but he looks all right. So that was my catalyst to get in the car and drive up to Aberdeen.
So being well connected for a scout is almost one of the most important things to be.
The amount of people that flag things up to me, and would I trust? I love Steve to death, but would I trust his word on X, Y, and Z player? Probably not. It was just him flagging that up to Eddie. Eddie saying to me, "When you get a chance, mate," it was more passive than anything else. And me, now you can have a look on Scout Best Actions or whatever and think, is he for us or isn't he? And probably make a decision just off some video clips. But back in 2011, that wasn't, 2012, that wasn't the way we operated. It was like, so I just got in the car and went. So you work on tip-offs, you work on statistics, obviously, that that can point the compass. I know a football club that's in League One now that used to be in the Championship and did well in the Championship, that used to buy the non-league newspaper every Sunday, and their scouting was based on the player grades from the reports in that paper. That's absolutely true. And they did all right. They got some good players out of it. So if a player was getting graded 8 every week in the non-league paper, they would go and watch him. I'm genuinely serious, because they couldn't afford all the analytical tools and the statistical data. That's the way they worked.
Yeah, wow.
Again, you never know who's watching.
You never do. But how do you end up trusting the people that you do then with these tip-offs?
Because if they keep giving me bad ones, they're no good. I don't. To be honest, there are only. I could probably count on 2 hands the people I trust, in terms of flagging players up to me, and because, as I sort of indicated earlier, I work abroad a lot. I have to follow my nose. I have to follow my instinct. If I turn up at Lyon's academy, I don't know any of those players unless I'm going there on a regular basis. But we know from history tells us Lyon's academy produces lots and lots of very good players, and I can name loads now: Cuisance, Aouar, Guri. I can go. I could probably give you 10 names if you really push me, that are all nearly household names right here, right now. So you know where the starting point is to a degree, particularly abroad. There's a small club in Sweden called Brommapojärna. Nobody really. You ask 100 people in the street, have you ever heard of Brommapojärna? They've never. But you look at players that have come from there and ended up going to Djurgården or AIK Stockholm, etc. It's incredible. They're just a little suburban football club. They're in the second league. They were in the first league for a year, a couple of years ago. They just seem to develop players. And the example I always cite is Nordsjælland in Denmark. It's just a conveyor belt of talent. So players that the guys would be familiar, Mohamed Kudus playing for Ajax, Sulemana playing for Rennes, Skol Volsen. I can go on and on. The players that are playing elite level have all come through Nordsjælland.
I mean, Denmark did well in the Euros last year, didn't they?
Well, the kid who scored the free kick, Damsgaard, now at Brentford. Yeah. Where did he come from? Nordsjælland.
Interesting, isn't it? With these places in Europe that produce so much players.
I should have a season ticket there, to be honest. But I mean, there are so many of these little provincial clubs in Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Haaland, Molde. We were there right at the beginning with Haaland. Right at the beginning, and I've got it there to prove.
Why is he not playing for Bournemouth now then, mate?
I hope Eddie Howe doesn't listen to this. He phoned me up and said, this kid who's just scored 9 goals in a game? I said, yeah, that's him. It was too late then.
In your opinion, then, Des, it's only your eye that really I'm questioning. What are the attributes that you look for in players that are attractive to you then?
Aesthetically, they have to look the part physically. Depending on position, what you look for in a centre-back is not what you look for in a centre midfielder, is not what you look for in a full-back, is not what you look for in number 10. There are all different definitions of what the purity of a player, but the first thing I look at is athleticism, always. Can they move? Can they run? How dynamic are they? I always say to my scouts, there's a difference between speed and pace. Speed is something you gauge over 10 metres. Pace is something you can gauge over 30 or 40 metres. And there are a lot of players who look really quick, but they flatten off very, very quickly also. So they can look really dynamic over 5 metres, but over 15 or 20 metres, if it's an attacking player, the centre-back gets back in and gets to them. So first thing is athleticism, speed and pace, depending on position. For a centre-back, obviously you look for different things, different attributes, physicality, ability, aerial ability, height, are they broad and strong, etc., etc. Fullbacks is one that divides opinion, because if you look at Ajer at the moment playing right back for Brentford, and you look at the left back, Rico Henry, there's about 9 inches difference in the two. So do you want a 5'7" dynamic left back, which Rico Henry is and was when he was at Walsall, or do you want a 6'4" right back who's more of a centre back? Who knows? But me personally, athleticism, speed and pace, then technical, then attitude and application.
It's interesting, mate, isn't it? Because I speak to so many players about their attributes really as a player, and almost all of them that are playing at the elite level always put so much emphasis and still do to this day on their fitness and their athleticism. And it just goes to show how really important it is that you have all the ability on a football in the world, but if you can't move, then you're going to really struggle to play the elite level.
You can cite players, Pirlo, for example, play Jorginho at the moment. He's not the most mobile, but they play the game in their head, so they have football intelligence. And if you watch the player closely enough, and I could probably give you some examples right now of players that aren't necessarily household names right here, right now, but will be, because they have footballing intelligence. They have an awareness that makes up for those physical, I won't say physical deficiencies, because they're all athletes, but the speed factor is critical. But you can usually pick out the players that have got an intelligence beyond the usual IQ of a footballer, where they will make their brain do the work rather than their legs. And Pirlo's an example.
So on the flip of that, what are the attributes that you see with your eye that are unattractive to you?
Again, depending on position. It's so position dependent. But what I hinted at with the boy in Czech Republic, attitude, application, reaction to not failure but disappointment. How does an individual react to that? I think there was a clip circulating about Mbappe, one of the greatest players in the world, without a shadow of a doubt. Lionel Messi didn't pass the ball to him, and he got the right ump. He's a world-class player, but you don't want to see that. And if an average player does that, it's far more important than Mbappe doing it because he has other assets. You just want to see a player that has a winning mentality, a team mentality, and wants to be better and wants to improve and shows that in his body language. And it goes back to you never know who's watching. So I would say to any young player out there, treat disappointment with optimism. Try not to let it manifest itself in your body language, because if you shrug your shoulders and throw your arms up in the air, that gets noticed, and that's going to hold you back.
It's incredible, isn't it? That, you know, the things that get noted, the players get noticed by these physical attributes, the technical attributes, can all literally be taken away by something that's not really even football related at all, by attitude and by, you know, those things that are seen from the naked eye. It's amazing, isn't it?
David Brooks, 4-1 down, Leicester, League Cup, 90th minute, goes in for a tackle, gets bullied out of the way. Player breaks with the ball. He runs full pelt over 10, 15 metres and gets a tackle in, puts it out for a throw-in. They're 4-1 down, 90 minutes gone. The game's gone. Doesn't matter. But he still wanted to win. That's what marks a player.
So even, like, you notice things even when teams are being, let's say, teams are being spanked like that, it's 4-1 down, you can still notice attributes about a player there.
How is a player? If a player, and I've got the report there, if they're 4-1 down in the cup, they're going out the cup, 90 minutes go. What motivates that player to still want to win that ball after he's just been bullied off it? It's internal. It's self-driven. So that tells me whatever shortfalls that player might have technically or in terms of pace and athleticism, if he's got a heart, if he's prepared to battle for the right, then you've got something to work with.
It's amazing insight, mate, especially for people watching this game. You know,
and if anybody wants to look at that clip, it's there for all to see. 90th minute, Leicester at home, 4-1 down, Carabao Cup or whatever it was, third round, September 2017, whenever it was. You can see the clip, and he still gets back in and does his job, even though he knows it's immaterial to the outcome of the game.
I've got, you know, the people who sort of watch this, you know, players, supporters, parents. It's almost like it's how difficult is it, mate? Everybody knows the right answers, right? All the players know exactly what they should be doing, but to actually do it is really difficult. To have a bad attitude and to toss things off is the easy thing to do, but it's so easily noticeable, right?
It is, if that's what you're looking for. Don't forget, if you're in a stadium of 30,000 people, 29,999 of them are probably not watching what David Brooks is doing in the 90th minute. But I'm there for a reason. So it might not be clearly apparent to everybody, but if you're focused and zoomed in on that one individual, you're going to notice when he picks his nose, when he pulls his socks up, when he ties his laces. You see everything because you're there to see everything. Because every little aspect of what he does gives you an understanding of his character. He probably doesn't know that you're doing that, but that's what I'm there for.
Amazing, Des. We're going to finish off, I call them quick fires, but, you know, I'll probably delve into a little bit more on each one for you. But the first one I've got here, you know, I acknowledge that you're obviously not a player, and most of the time I ask these questions to players. And the first one is always the best advice anybody has ever given to you.
Wow, that's a bit of a curveball question. Approach every player and every game with an open mind. Never go in with a preconcept. The biggest fault of a scout is stubbornness. So if you've made your mind up that player is not good enough, be prepared to have your mind changed. Give the kid another chance, and don't be stubborn. So be receptive and be open-minded to something that you think you know the answer to. That doesn't necessarily always mean it's the right answer.
Have you had any, times like that where you've had to change your mind on a player?
Oh, definitely, yeah. And that was one thing that, from a self-development perspective, I had to learn very, very quickly, is that just because I don't like a player on first or second viewing, it doesn't mean to say that he's a write-off. You just be patient. But when you do form an opinion, make sure it's an informed opinion. So the answer to the question, be open-minded.
Second one I've got for you, Des, is the best player you've ever spotted that has gone on to be successful, and what was it about them that attracted you to them?
I don't even know where to start with that one.
I know there's a few.
So, Tammy Abraham, I was told by educated people that he was going to be a disaster as a loan signing for Bristol City. I was only at Bristol City 7 months, but I like to think that I gave him... I did everything right with Tammy in terms of how I scouted him, approaching the agent, speaking to Michael Emanolo at Chelsea. So Tammy would be right up there in terms of me believing in him when others didn't. So for that reason, Tammy, from an ability perspective, two spring to mind, Lewis Cook and David Brooks, because I still can't believe to this day that Bournemouth managed to sign those two players, because they were better than us. They were better than us. But I did my job and I worked diligently. And Jason Pearce gave me the heads up on Cookie. So I speak to so many players, ex-players that have played for Bournemouth, etc., because I trust players. I shouldn't say this, but Sam Vokes is like the best scout I've got. He's unbelievable. I love him to death. And it's no surprise that we signed half of the Welsh team. David Brooks, Chris Mepham, Harry Wilson. Folksy helped me with all of that.
He's been on here, Folksy, as well.
I love that kid.
I actually had to make him do it twice, because the first time I did it with Folksy, I said, "Are you ready to go?" Press the button on the camera. What I'd actually done is press stop. So I'd done a whole conversation that wasn't recorded.
Oh, no.
So then 2 weeks later, obviously, amazing guy, did it again. But these guys, Brooks has obviously been going through what he's been going through, but everybody can see that he's a super talented player. Lewis Cook, in my opinion, is exceptional. We played it behind closed doors against them this pre-season, and Lewis Cook was, luckily for me, I didn't play against him. We played 45 minutes. He played in the second half, and it's just such a joy to watch him play after all the stuff that he's gone through.
He's a proper footballer too. Though he made his England day. See, people say to me, you don't get remunerated financially. And I say, yeah, but when Ryan Fraser makes his debut for Scotland, and Lewis Cook makes his debut for England, and Tammy Abraham makes his debut for England, etc., etc., that's when I feel vindicated. And I'm not saying I was the only one with David or with Lewis, certainly with Tammy, but the other guys have got to buy into it as well. But if you've got a relationship with the manager and the recruitment department, you earn the right to get trusted on your judgment. So David Brooks, Lewis Cook, Tammy Abraham, Nathan Akey would be the other one, because
he's done all right, hasn't he?
Yeah, and like I always knew, if ever a player epitomises what I'm talking to about attitude and making the most of what he's got, then Nathan's that boy. And his character and his personality, everything's left out on the pitch. So where there are certain aspects of Nathan's game that could, he's not the tallest for a centre-back, etc., etc., but you've got to... I knew Nathan almost better than his parents knew him, and I'd never spoken to him because I watched him so much, and I watched him on loan at Reading, and I watched him at Chelsea, and I watched him I knew when he'd come from Rotterdam, and like I just followed that. He went out on loan at Watford, and Jose Mourinho was saying he's going to be a left back for me and all that, and I'm saying to Ed, no, he's going to be a centre back for you, Ed, not a left back, because he hasn't got those lung busting up and down runs that you want. So Nathan, I love that boy, but yeah, he wasn't everybody's cup of tea. But I persisted and kept saying, yeah, you got to do this one. And now he's playing for Man City. So
incredible. A third one I've got for you, mate, is the most important thing, in your opinion, young players should be doing if they want to get picked up by professional clubs.
Presenting themselves correctly. Turning up with a winning mentality, a good attitude. And it comes back to all the things I've said about how you apply yourself off the ball, how you apply yourself in the warm-ups, how you react to adversity, how you respond to bad moments in the game. Always be aware that it's not all about you, and people will have a perception of what you are from your actions.
Is it mad that you've not just mentioned anything there about technical, physical ability, but it's mostly all attitude, present?
You can, anybody can go and watch a game and say he's good, but that doesn't necessarily make him an elite athlete. In terms of, you look at any sport, the absolute elite are people who are dedicated to what they do. And unless you're dedicated to what you do and you have a perception that other people are watching, there's a bigger chance for failure.
Number 4, the best advice you can give to parents on how to manage their child's situation if they've not yet been picked up by academies.
Be patient. Trust your kid. Let the kid trust you. Don't be nepotistic. Don't be judgmental. Try to be constructive with your child, and understand that different kids mature at different ages. So if you're playing in under 13s and 4 or 5 of those are getting picked up by, and your boy isn't or girl isn't, don't think that's the end, because he might be a little bit behind in adolescence, in his maturity, or how receptive they are to the coaching, intelligence levels. So just be patient. Be as patient as you can without being demanding on the child. And don't stand on the touchline screaming and shouting, because there are other players out there, and it's sometimes disrespectful to the other players. Try to be, of course you're passionate about your child, I understand that, and you want the best for your child, but let the child lead you there. Don't try and push him there.
The last one I've got for you, mate, is the best advice you can give to players already within the game on how they can progress their career.
Live your life right. Eat and drink the right things, get plenty of sleep, train hard, work hard. There's no replacement for hard work.
How do you find out that about players if they're
other players?
You do?
Ask other players and coaches and managers.
So even like when you've spotted the players technically, physically what you want, like what's then the process of you finding out about their personalities?
Okay, so player that I loved who's playing in the League One at the moment, I stayed behind after a game once because I really, really liked him I saw him first down in Southampton playing for the team that he was playing for at the moment. I won't say who it was. And he was so strong and powerful and quick. So I hung around, not that day because they were playing away. Went and watched him in a FA Youth Cup game, waited in the car park afterwards, and I didn't like the people he was hanging around with. So he came out to the car park and I'm thinking, oof, that don't look good. That player should have done a hell of a lot better with his career, but he's matured now. But as a young guy, he was keeping bad company and going to bad places with bad people doing bad things, and it cost him a potential Premier League career. And if he was in the room now, he'd probably admit it.
And that's something that you can become aware of, obviously, as a scout when you're doing your homework.
The last thing I can afford to do is recommend players to the football club or Eddie, whoever it is, and then find out that they're not drinkers, gamblers, whatever. Leave it to your imagination. That has an effect on the assessment of those people of what I do. I have to bring them the right type of character, and if for me to do that, he can be all the things that you want him to be on the pitch, but if he's not doing the right things off the pitch, that's going to reflect on me because I haven't done my work properly. And again, I probably go beyond the call of duty in that, but that's why I've maintained it, or feel like I've maintained a level of productivity and maintained a level of excellence in terms of, I don't get everything right, but I try to know that as many factors as possible have been taken care of so that I eliminate the chances of getting too much wrong.
Des, thank you very much, mate.
You're
that
welcome.
Was such an incredible insight into the world of scouting, really, and how that can really have an impact on players. I know there's stuff that we've spoken about now that probably players who are playing have no idea about. So, I really, really appreciate your insight and the information that you've given us.
Yeah, if you really want to make it, just be dedicated. Same in my profession. I've dedicated myself to the profession. I feel like I've achieved above and beyond. And if players want to achieve above their ability levels, dedicate yourself to what you're doing. Give yourself every chance.
Incredible advice, mate. Thank
No
you
worries,
very
mate.
much for your
Cheers.
time, Des. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.